So, hi guys, it's Alex here for Chessfactor, continuing our series on the Caro-Kann. This video here is going to be the shortest of all of the videos. It's just a little coverage on one of the more unusual options for white. It's the so-called Breyer variation, and it starts after e4, c6, we have our Caro-Kann, and here white, instead of pushing the pawn to d4, which is the most common move, instead puts the pawn only on d3. Now black plays the normal move, pawn to d5, and here white brings the knight to d2. This move makes sense because if white were to play, let's say, the king's knight to f3, black could actually already capture on e4, and after the capture back, we can see that position on the board, black could capture the queen and cost white his right to castle. So because of this, white usually brings the knight to d2, and now we can profit from the fact that the square e5 is not under white's control, either by a pawn on d4 or by a knight on f3. So we can simply play the move pawn to e5 here, taking control of the center. White will develop his knight to f3 and attack the pawn on e5, and we should protect it with our bishop while developing our king side. Now, the Breyer splits into two major options for white. There's a slow option, which we'll consider second, and then there's a more dynamic option that we really need to watch out for, and it's this move, pawn to d4. If we haven't seen this, it might look a little bit scary, because all of a sudden, there's a lot of tension in the center of the board, and we may not know what is the best way to capture back. In my opinion here, the best move for black is pawn takes d4, e takes d4. And here, white's best bet, and what he plays, is e takes d5 most of the time. This is the move that white goes for. Now, perhaps the tricky move to keep in mind, rather than capturing back, c takes d5, and now after knight takes d4, being left with an IQP position that would be okay, but perhaps is not quite as good as what we can get if we play the best moves. Instead of this, what I'm going to recommend is that we just continue our development with the move knight f6. Now we're threatening to take this pawn even with a knight, and this way we would not have to worry about an IQP possibility if white does something very passive. White here should grab this pawn on c6, but now we can actually take back, knight takes c6, and we've gone for very fast development and are defending our pawn on d4. This position might be a little bit scary for black players who are inexperienced playing an IQP position, where this pawn has no pawn in adjacent files defending it, but in fact this is a pretty good version of it that we have here. For example, the game might continue bishop e2, white seeks to castle kingside, black castles kingside, white castles kingside, and now one last maneuver that I think is useful to keep in mind, it's the move bishop to c7. The point is that white will soon play knight b3 and put a lot of pressure on this pawn on d4, and it's critical for us to not lose that pawn if we can avoid it. So we play bishop c7, and we anticipate that if white plays knight b3, we will have the move bishop to b6 defending the pawn. After this, we can simply seek to develop our pieces. Maybe the bishop will go to f5, maybe it will go to g4, the rook will come to e8. But overall, I can promise you that this is a good version of an isolated queen's pawn. This pawn may be a little bit vulnerable and you have to take care of it, but on the other hand, it's in white's half of the board and it's really cramping the white opponent. So this is a nice position, and you should welcome this position into your repertoire unless you really detest playing with an IQP, but I would recommend this position. Let's consider the slower option. Let's move back to the position where instead of playing that fast d4, white can play g3. So, in this position here, white sometimes simply plays g3 and plays for a fianchettoing of his bishop, and one of the ideas that white has is that at some point he may capture on d5, and after capture and capture back, this pawn on d5 may be quite weak, and the bishop on g2 may actually be very well placed. After g3, the move that I recommend is knight to f6, putting pressure in the center, and after bishop g2, simply castling kingside. Black is playing very natural moves and is certainly having no problems in development. And after castle, we will sort of leave the position more or less here after the move rook e8, and we should be quite happy with the outcome of the opening. We have a nice center here on e5 and d5. We have good, well-placed pieces, the bishop on d6 and the knight on f6. And the only thing that I want to really show you is that in this position, black can continue with two plans that I quite like. I like them both equally, so keep them in mind. The first plan is that black at some point, but maybe on the very next move, in fact, place the bishop on g4, and if white kicks it away, so for example, bishop g4 kicks it away, then black can keep the bishop and even slot it back to g6 from where it will press e4, and it will be quite an active piece. The other plan that I quite like is to place the knight on d7, supporting your center further, and now the question is, how are you going to develop this bishop if you aren't going to take it there and you're going to block it with a knight? So the answer there is that black at some point may play pawn to b6 and develop the bishop via b7, or may simply keep the bishop on c8 for now and play a5 and expand on the queen side. The only thing that I would advise against is playing into white's hand directly by locking down the center. A lot of people, or rather a lot of computers, think that this move is quite good, but from a human perspective, you have to be very careful, because by locking down the center, you allow white to at some point move this knight and launch a slow attack in the spirit of the King's Indian attack. So I would say a nice idea is to keep the tension on the board and continue your development with either knight d7 and expanding on the queen side, or with bishop g4, which pins the knight, and then maybe drag the bishop back to g6, which puts more pressure on the center. In general, we should not be too worried about this capture, because after c takes d5, so far our pawn is still defended, our queen x-rays it, and we can potentially support it further with the bishop, and also the c6 square has cleared for the knight. So that's about it as far as the Breyer variation goes. It's quite a rare encounter, so we won't spend too much time on it, but I hope that if somebody decides to surprise you with this variation in the future, that at least you have a little bit of an idea of how to handle it and how to bring out your pieces. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.